This is Chapter 5, The American Revolution. We're going to be looking at how the crisis began, the road to revolution, becoming independence, and look at how the colonists secured their independence from Great Britain. In this first section, we'll be looking at the causes and the significance of the Stamp Act and how that led to the crisis in the colony. Now, the experience and the cost of the 7 Years' War led Great Britain, where King George had assumed the throne in 1760, to consolidate its growing empire and to make the colonists share its costs. Before the war, the British had attempted to impose new trading regulations, which had reinforced the Navigation Act, limited and controlled the colonists' trade. In the 1740s, a board of trade, which was responsible for the colonial affairs, had attempted to expand its influence over colonial government, trying, for example, to bring colonial laws into conformity with royal instructions. These new regulations failed, mostly in part because the colonists ignored them. Now, during the 7 Years' War, the British viewed the colonists more as equals and recognized their contributions in winning the conflict. However, after the war, in the mid-1760s, the British returned to this view of colonists as subordinates, whose role was to enrich the mother country. And without precedent, the British rulers sought to enact reforms that would make administration of the colonies more efficient and systematic, and in order to raise funds to help pay for the war, which had cost the British a lot more than it had cost the colonies, and it wanted to help finance their empire. To them, it seemed fair to force the Americans to follow the Navigation Act to help reduce the war debt and to pay for continued British protection. Furthermore, almost all Britons believed that Parliament represented the entire empire and rightfully legislated for it. Millions of Britons had no representatives in Parliament, and according to this theory of virtual representation, however, while they did not have representatives, they were still constituents of every member of the Parliament, whose duty was to represent the whole empire, not just their district. Americans, however, argued that they could not be taxed without enjoying direct representation in Parliament, and really didn't find much support in Britain. In the early 1760s, British efforts to combat smuggling by issuing general search warrants and the Proclamation of 1763, which sparked further settlement on lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, sparked protests in the colonies. This response, however, was little compared to the colonists' outrage that happened in 1764 and 1765 over new laws, which included the Sugar, Revenue, and Currency Acts. These measures that colonists believed infringed on their liberties and limited the profits they earned from previously less regular trade. You can see here on the engraving from the Massachusetts Almanac, was published in 1774, shows the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who was managing the colony. His house had been destroyed by a mob 9 years earlier, and the devil is carrying a list of his crimes. It's very common during this time period to see religious figures like the devil demonizing political opponents. In 1765, we have the Stamp Act, which is an unprecedented reform. This act did not expand the Navigation Act, but instead directly taxed activities within the colonies, instead of taxing imports and exports like the Navigation Act did. Now, within the act, or with this act, Parliament had tried to raise money by requiring that all kinds of printed matter, such as newspapers, books, and court documents, all that were produced in the colonies, carry a stamp that was issued by British authorities. What this would do was raise funds for the stationing of British troops in the colonies, and without having to ask or force colonial assemblies to provide the money. While previous regulations affected mostly those colonies directly involved in the trade, the Stamp Act instead is affecting every colonist, many of whom were resentful towards the tax, and it interfered with the free flow of information. Also, it was imposed without the consent of the colonial government. It paid for British troops whose presence a lot of people felt was an unnecessary intrusion. Colonists who opposed the tax viewed it as an infringement on their traditional English liberties. It was taking their property without consent, and sometimes it referred to these as their natural rights. British rulers and the colonists had different ideas about the British Empire. The British saw the empire as a system of unequal parts. There are different principles governing different areas, and all of these areas were subject to Parliament's authority. Colonists in the Americas and India viewed the empire as an association of equals, in which free colonists had the same rights as Britons at home. In late 1765, the Stamp Act Congress, which had delegates for most of the North American colonies, affirmed the Americans' loyalty to Great Britain, while at the same time insisting on their right to be consented for taxation, or to have their consent for taxation. Americans were beginning to see Parliament no longer as their safeguard to English liberty, but really kind of their principal enemy. You see here in this picture, according to the doctrine of virtual representation, the House of Commons is representing all residents of the British Empire, regardless of whether or not they voted. In this cartoon, we're seeing a criticism of the idea. Blinded Britannia on the far left is stumbling into a pit. Next to her, two colonists complain of being robbed by British taxation. In the background, we see the Catholic city of Quebec and the Protestant town of Boston, which is in flames. Here's an engraving by James Otis that is gracing the cover of the Boston Almanac of 1770. He is flanked by the ancient gods Hercules and Minerva, who is carrying the Liberty Cap. This teapot, protesting the Stamp Act, interestingly enough, was produced in England and then marketed and sold in colonial America, which really kind of shows us the close political and economic connection between the empire and the colonies. Now, ideas, icons of liberty, like the Liberty trees, Liberty poles, really became central and a part of the American colonists' resistance to the Stamp Act. Inspired by colonists in Boston who had protested the Sugar and Currency Acts, colonial leaders formed committees of correspondence that communicated with one another and successfully coordinated efforts to prevent the Stamp Act implementation. In cities like New York and Boston, crowds often organized by the Sons of Liberty destroyed the stamps, forced those administering the law to resign, and the coercive activities of the Sons of Liberty, which were supported mostly by urban artisans, laborers, and sailors, frightened both the imperial officers in the colonies and the colonial elites who opposed the Stamp Act, but preferred a more orderly and peaceful protest. Though the Americans' resistance and pressure from London merchants and manufacturers afraid of losing American markets led Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1776, they also simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which affirmed that Parliament had the authority and the power to pass laws in the future that would affect the colonies. This included new taxes. You can see here in this warning by the Sons of Liberty, this is really warning against the use of the stamps that you see on the left that were part of the Stamp Act. Now, the 1760s also saw a considerable amount of internal social turmoil within the colonies. In the western backcountry of many colonies, the conflicting land claims of settlers, speculators, colonial governments, and Indians sparked disputes. Rural settlers and farmers had long resented the power and influence of land speculators and large proprietors. In the mid-1760s, a group of South Carolina settlers, calling themselves the Regulators, protested the underrepresentation of Western settlements in the colony's assembly and the failure to establish local governments that could regularize land titles and impose law and order. In North Carolina, groups of small farmers taking the same name refused to pay taxes, they disrupted courts, attacked local officials, and the property of land speculators, merchants, and lawyers. These armed farmers were suppressed only in 1771 by the colony's militia. In the mid-1760s, tenants on large estates of landowners in New York's Hudson River Valley called themselves the Sons of Liberty, stopped paying rent, began to seize land. They were also suppressed by colonial militia and took up arms to defend their land claims and resist colonial authorities. Such turmoil made some colonial elites fear that resistance to British authority threatened their own power and authority over the subordinates within the colonies. So they cautioned against further protests against the British Empire. Now in this next section we're going to be looking at which events were key in sharpening the divisions between the British and the colonists in the early 1770s, late 1760s. Now in 1767 the British government imposed a new set of taxes on the American colonies. This was designed by the Chancellor Exchequer, Charles Townshend, which was the government's chief financial officer. Taking at their word American statements that they did not object to taxes on trade, the Townshend duties taxed goods imported into the colonies and established a new board of customs commissioners to collect the taxes, suppress smuggling, and to raise funds in order to free judges and governors from their dependence on the colonies and the colonial assemblies for financial support. Although American merchants opposed these taxes, the colonial opposition developed more slowly as in comparison to the Stamp Act. A colonial boycott on imported British goods had developed in Boston and spread to the southern colonies, where many southern planters hoped to use the boycott to reduce their debt to British merchants. Boycotters celebrated the virtue of American resistance and denigrated the luxury of British society by producing their own homespun clothing. Although urban artisans welcomed this end to competition for British imports and strongly supported non-importation, they were at first very reluctant to honor the boycott. And in some cities, extra-legal committees and crowds were around and were attempting to enforce it. Boston, we will see, is at the center of resistance. British troops had been stationed there since 1768 when a riot against British attempts to enforce trade regulations had occurred. The troops were unpopular and had been competing for jobs on the waterfront with the city's laborers. On March 5th, 1770, there was a fight between Bostonians and British soldiers that escalated into an armed confrontation that resulted in the death of 5 Bostonians. The commander and 8 soldiers were put on trial, and they were defended by John Adams. Now, John Adams opposed the British policies. At the same time, he also opposed the lower class crowd's actions against them. Now, 2 of the British soldiers were convicted of manslaughter, and the rest were found not guilty. However, Paul Revere and other colonists used this event to stir up indignation against the British through very inaccurate but widely circulated propaganda that depicted the incident as a massacre of unarmed Bostonians. Non-importation had temporarily cut British imports by a third, and although the boycott on the Townshend's duties kind of faltered by 1770, British merchants' fear of future trade disruptions led to repeal of the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea. The British also agreed to remove troops from Boston, and American merchants abandoned their boycott. Now, there was also controversy within Britain over the treatment of John Wilkes, which reinforced the Americans' sense that there was political corruption and other ills that were eroding British freedom. Wilkes was a radical journalist who had scandalized authorities with writings about the king and his monarchy, and he was elected to Parliament from London, but then later expelled. Cries of Wilkes and liberty rallied colonists and Britons in the mother country. British American Protestants were also troubled by rumors that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, had planned to send bishops to the colonies and were worried that religious courts in order to punish dissenters would soon be established. This furthered their fear of their freedom. You can see in this picture we have Paul Revere's engraving, the Boston Massacre. Again, remember that this was really an armed confrontation between the colonists and the British military. This was not a massacre as Paul Revere depicts it, in which unarmed citizens are fired upon by the well-trained British army. Here we see John Wilkes being depicted holding the Liberty Cap. He becomes a very popular symbol for freedom on both sides of the Atlantic, both in Britain and in the United States. Now, the next colonial crisis demonstrated how events of the British Empire really affected and reverberated in America. The East India Company was a giant trading monopoly that really effectively ruled in India, these areas that have recently been acquired by Great Britain. However, when a speculative bubble destroyed their company's stock, a stock in which many British merchants, bankers, and other elites had invested in, the British government decided to help rescue the company by marketing its surplus tea in North America. By this time, tea is not a luxury good, but instead a consumer necessity that's popular among all social classes, both in Britain and in America. The British government, which is headed by Lord North, gave the company advantages that allowed it to dump its low-priced tea on the American market, which undercut colonial merchants and their smugglers. It wanted to use the taxes on the imported tea to help pay for the costs of colonial government, another move that threatened the colonial assembly's control over finance. Although the tea tax was not new, many colonists argued that a tax on a large new body of tea imports would acknowledge Britain's right to tax the colonies. Mounting opposition culminated in what much later became known as the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists, disguised as Indians, dumped tea from British ships into Boston Harbor, which caused enormous loss to the East India Company. Now, North's government and Parliament responded with a series of laws intended to punish the colonies. And these became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, were known in Great Britain as the Coercive Acts. They closed the port of Boston until the East India Company had been compensated for its losses. It altered the Massachusetts Charter of 1691 by stopping town meetings and authorized the governor to appoint council members who had previously been elected. And it also allowed the British military commanders to house troops in colonists' private homes. At the same time, Parliament is passing the Quebec Act, which extends Canada's boundaries and allowed for legal toleration of the Roman Catholic Church in this new British province. This is meant to secure the allegiance of British new subjects. The Quebec Act also caused many colonists, especially New England Protestants, to fear that the British now threatened both their political and religious freedoms. This is the Bostonians paying the excise man. You can see the colonists pouring tea down the throat of the tax collector, who has also been tarred and feathered. A noose is hanging from the tree of liberty. And in the background, we see the Boston Tea Party. This is the Mitchard Minuet, British cartoon, showing 4 Roman Catholic bishops dancing around a copy of the Quebec Act. On the left, British officials Lord Bute, Lord North, and Lord Mansfield are looking on as the devil oversees everything. Now, in this next section, we're going to be focusing on the coming independence, the events that are really moving towards American independence. Now, by 1774, British actions had eroded the imperial government's legitimacy among many colonists. So opposition to the Intolerable Acts spread to small towns, rural areas that had not yet been participating in resistance, while colonists, particularly those in New England, intimidated, harassed, and sometimes assaulted British officials and colonists who supported British policies. So a September convention of delegates from towns across Massachusetts issued the Suffolk Resolve, which urged Americans to refuse to obey the new laws, withhold their taxes, and to prepare for war. To coordinate resistance to the act, that month a Continental Congress also met in Philadelphia. This Congress was composed of political leaders from all of the colonies except for Georgia. They included men like John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, and from Virginia, George Washington and Patrick Henry, who later famously declared to his fellow Virginians, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Congress adjourned in October 1774 after it agreed to meet the following May if its demands were not met. It endorsed the Suffolk Resolve and formed the Continental Association to virtually stop all trade with Great Britain and the West Indies. The Congress, through this association, authorized local committees of safety to enforce their policies and act against any enemies of liberty who violated the boycott or used it as an opportunity to raise prices. This was the beginning of a process that transferred effective political power from colonial governments, whose authority were derived from Great Britain, to these extra-legal bodies reflecting more the popular will. By early 1775, thousands of men, many of whom were without property and who had never before been part of the political nation, were serving on these committees, which became experiments for self-government and soon revolution. By 1774 and 1775, the notions of British liberty that had been a part of British American culture were being invoked by the colonists of all backgrounds, and now against Britain itself. As the crisis intensified, more and more Americans began to base their claims for liberty not just on the historical rights of Englishmen, but on a more abstract language of natural rights and universal freedom. This language included John Locke's idea of natural rights that existed prior to the establishment of government, and it provided a powerful justification for resistance to British rule. When the Second Continental Congress met again in May of 1775, war had already begun between the British soldiers and armed Massachusetts citizens. In April of that month, the British forces were marching towards Concord and had been met by colonists in the city of in the town of Lexington. Skirmishes both in Lexington and Concord initiated the American War of Independence and inspired colonists in New England and elsewhere to take up arms. The Second Continental Congress soon authorized the raising of an army, the printing of money to pay for it, and appointed George Washington as its commander. Now, despite the war's outbreak, many colonists were reluctant to embrace independence from Great Britain. Many of them were still proud of their British political institutions and culture and power and glory of the British Empire, and more than a few of the political leaders were worried that rebellion might cause internal social conflict, particularly between the elite and the disenfranchised, less wealthy Americans. Leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia, who were upset by the Intolerable Acts and confident of their ability to retain authority in these colonies, supported independence, as did many Southern leaders who guarded their political liberties, and were enraged by a British proclamation in Virginia in late 1775, which offered freedom to escaped slaves who enlisted in the Royal Army. In New York and Pennsylvania, there was a consensus was a little bit more difficult to establish. There was opposition to British policies, had upset and really kind of sparked the interest of small farmers and urban artisans whose calls for greater voice in political life had prompted many leaders to hesitate to call for independence. Some in these colonies urged for compromise and predicted that a war would unleash fighting between the colonies. Here you see a picture of the Battle of Concord, the Old North Bridge. This is also the inspiration for Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord Hymn, 1837, where he says that this fired the shot that was heard round the world. Here we see the commemoration of the battles of Lexington and Concord that was carved into a powder horn by a soldier, James Pike, or to commemorate those battles. You see at the center, the Liberty Tree is part of the picture. Now, Common Sense was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine. He was not a colonist, in fact, but was a recent immigrant to Philadelphia from England, and he offered arguments that really catalyzed the final move towards independence. It was published in January of 1776, and it criticized the British Constitution for its principles of hereditary rule and monarchical government. He argued that tyranny survived in the form of the monarchy and the aristocratic House of Lords. He argued that only a democratic system based on frequent elections with a single written constitution would ensure liberty. Most importantly, Paine argued that America's future prospects with the British Empire were limited. Once America was free from the Navigation Acts and trading freely with the world, its prosperity would be assured. Free from Great Britain, the colonies would also not be entangled in the wars with other European powers, against which many of the American colonies had never had any grievances. Paine argued that the colonies' membership in the British Empire was more burdensome than it was beneficial. He ended the pamphlet by assuring his readers that American independence was linked with the freedom of people everywhere, and argued that a new nation would become a haven of freedom and an asylum for mankind. Now, although most of Paine's ideas were not original, he addressed them to all Americans and made it accessible by expressing them in a very clear, direct, plain language that was really unusual in most political writing of the time. It quickly became one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing. The intensification of the war, combined with his stirring appeal for independence, sparked more calls for independence in many American communities. We see here Thomas Paine, our advocate, in a 1791 portrait, and this is the front cover of Common Sense. Now, on July 2nd of 1776, Congress formally declared the United States as an independent nation, and 2 days later they adopted the Declaration of Independence, which had been authored by Thomas Jefferson and revised by the Congress before its approval. Most of the Declaration was a long list of grievances that were directed against the king, protesting his recent policies that threatened to impose on the colonists absolute tyranny. Although there was a clause condemning the slave trade and criticizing the king for overturning laws limiting slave importation, this was eliminated after protests by delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. The impact and legacy of the Declaration was contained in its preamble, which was written by Jefferson, stating that all men are created equal. They're endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Justified independence by arguing that a government derives its power from the consent of the people. That when it threatens its subjects' natural rights, the people have the authority to alter or to abolish it. The Declaration ultimately asserts the right of revolution. Now, the Declaration of Independence forever altered the meaning of American liberty. It completed this transformation of the object of American independence from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of mankind. Jefferson's arguing in the Declaration that natural laws, not the British Constitution or the rights of freeborn Englishmen, is what's justifying America's separation from Britain. And the Declaration made the body or people of certain social class made freedom a universal entitlement for all people, not just a privilege to be enjoyed by some group of people of a certain social class. He drew upon the theories of John Locke, but instead substituted pursuit of happiness for property, and Jefferson establishes America's political culture as this open-ended democratic process in which individuals develop their own potential and will seek to create or realize their own life goals. He made individual self-fulfillment, unimpeded by government, the central element of American freedom. He's removing tradition as an obstacle to America's desire to shape society as they saw fit. You see here, this is an early draft with lots of correction by Thomas Jefferson to the Declaration of Independence. Now, the American Revolution created a very distinct definition of national identity, which rested on freedom. From its beginning, this notion of American exceptionalism, which is the belief that the United States has a special mission to be a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world, this has been central to American nationality and nationalism. Paine and others believe the American Revolution was an event of global historical importance with the power to reshape the world. Without the burden of a monarchy, the aristocracy, and the hereditary privilege of the old world of Europe, America would be a new nation governed by principles of universal freedom. While the American colonists were more interested in gaining international recognition and the military aid of other governments than they were in establishing human rights for all people everywhere, the Declaration's words did have inspirational aspects to Americans and to colonies of people throughout the world who have sought independence. Over time, the natural rights that Jefferson asserted became less and less part of the declarations he hoped to inspire, and the idea of legitimate political authority rests on the will of the people, and that the people have rights has really been more of the focus of declarations later on that have been adopted around the world. These words have inspired a diverse array of groups, including Caribbean slaves, colonial subjects in India, and even indigenous people of Latin America to fight for their liberty. You see here in America as a symbol of liberty in 1775. This is an engraving that was on the cover of the Pennsylvania magazine that was edited by Thomas Paine. The shield displays the colony's coat of arms. The female figure is holding a liberty cap surrounded by weaponry of the patriotic struggle, including a cartridge box marked Liberty, hanging from a tree that is on the right. Now, in this last section, we're going to be looking at how the American forces were able to secure independence and win during the Revolutionary War. Now, for Americans, the challenges to obtaining real independence, as opposed to just declaring it, were enormous, and Britain, which saw the colonists as rebellious traitors, was determined to crush them. The new American army is facing the greatest military power in the world, with a well-trained, professional, disciplined army, which is supplemented by hired soldiers from German states like the Hessians, the world's most powerful navy, and experienced military commanders. The Americans had local militias, a poorly equipped continental army, many of whom were undisciplined, and they had no navy to speak of. Yet, many Americans had military experience, particularly those who fought in the 7 Years' War or had militia training. Americans were fighting on their own soil for a revolutionary cause which had inspired sacrifice and devotion. And during the war's 8 years, some 200,000 men served in the Continental Army as volunteers or in the militia, where service was required of every able-bodied man. By the war's end, 1 in 20 of the free white male population of the colonies between ages 16 to 45 had died. That's the equivalent of nearly 3 million deaths in today's population. However, the hope for independence survived as long as the American army existed. The British learned that despite their power, the conquest of the 13 colonies was an enormous and expensive endeavor which might require higher taxes than the British in the mother country would that they would eventually resent. The British made a series of mistakes, misjudging the degree of support for independence among the Americans and the capacity of their citizen soldiers. European rivals, particularly those in France, welcomed British defeat and would equalize the balance of forces in the struggle if they supported America. You can see in this picture there's an engraving by John Cartwright that was published as an appeal for the annual election of Parliament as essential to liberty in Britain. He included in an engraving contrasting the principles of reform on the left with that of despotism on the right. This is a French engraving depicting the New Yorkers tearing down the statue of King George III after the Declaration was adopted in July 1776. The statue was later melted down in order to make bullets for the Continental Army. Now, although George Washington at first would not accept black recruits in the Continental Army, he reversed his policy After the British offered up a proclamation where they would give freedom to Virginia slaves who escaped and then served in the British military. Around 5,000 blacks enlisted in the American army and militia, some of whom were slaves and promised freedom if they served as substitutes for their master or their master's son. Blacks fighting under George Washington served in racially integrated unions. This was the last black Americans to do so in regular units until the Korean War. Except for South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonies also enrolled free blacks and slaves to fight. While these colonies did not explicitly promise the slaves their freedom, many received it individually once the war concluded, at which time Virginia emancipated slaves who had served in the American army. Hundreds of blacks, particularly slaves, found freedom and opportunity, however, by enlisting in the British military. Even some of the 17 of George Washington's slaves who fled to the British joined the fight against American colonists. You can see here, this is American Foot Soldiers, the Yorktown Campaign. This is a watercolor by a French officer. Includes a black soldier from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which is an all-black unit of about 250 men. Now, the war was very slow at first. British commanders in Washington's determination to avoid direct confrontation helped to ensure that the beginning of the war was slow. This is in order to buy time to gain international support, in order to prevent the destruction of the American army, really made for an inconclusive beginning to the war. Though the British captured New York in 1776 and pushed the Americans back through New Jersey, Washington saved a demoralized and shrinking army in a successful surprise attack in that state, in Trenton in December of 1776 and in Princeton in January of 1777. In October of 1777, a second British army advancing south from Canada into New York was intended to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. It was surrounded and defeated and forced to surrender at Saratoga. While the British army remained quartered in New York, American troops suffered a punishing winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The victory at Saratoga helped persuade the French in 1778 to recognize the United States and begin to supply it with military assistance. Spain soon joined the war on the American side as well. Though these allies at first limited their attacks, the entry of France into the war in particular forced the British to defend not only America but much of its global empire, and significantly weakened its capacity to wage war in North America. This is the triumphal entry of the royal troops into New York. This is an engraving showing the army of Sir William Howe occupying the city in 1776. New York would remain in British hands for the rest of the war. This is a map of the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1781. Shows key battles in the North during the War of Independence, including Lexington and Concord, which had begun the armed conflict, the campaign in New York and New Jersey, and Saratoga. Saratoga, a lot of times, is called the turning point of the war. In 1778, the center of the war moved to the southern colonies, where the British hoped to take advantage of social tensions between frontier farmers and wealthy planters, enlist the many loyalists of that region, and disrupt the economy by encouraging slaves to escape. By 1780, British forces had occupied Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, and seemed to control much of the South. This year was perhaps the lowest point in the war for Americans. Congress was basically bankrupt, and the army had gone without pay for several months, experienced several mutinies. More and more, loyalists were flocking to British lines along with tens of thousands of slaves. Irregular warfare launched by colonial militia in the South and a brutal civil war in much of North and South Carolina and Georgia between patriot and loyalist militias, with both sides committing atrocities and destroying property, did not crush the rebellion in the South. Finally, 1781, defeats and costly campaigns weakened British forces there commanded by Lord Cornwallis, who had moved his army to Yorktown, located on the Virginia Peninsula. Washington rushed his forces there and with French troops laid siege, which, when supported by French naval blockade, forced Cornwallis to surrender his army there in October of 1781. Imperial rivalry between Europe's great colonial powers had helped to create the American colonies and had now secured their independence as a new nation. Public support for the war collapsed in Great Britain, where many thought the West Indies were more valuable and merchants hoped to renew trade with America. 1783, Great Britain recognized America's independence in the Treaty of Paris and ceded the entire area between Canada and Florida east of the Mississippi River. The Americans promised not to persecute loyalists and to restore them the property that had been seized during the war, but many loyalists instead left for Great Britain, Canada, or other parts of the empire. Until independence, the 13 colonies in North America had been only part of British Empire in the Western Hemisphere. In Canada and the West Indies, where planters had feared slave revolt, colonists refused Americans' appeal to join the war against the mother country. But with the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America became the first independent nation in the hemisphere, reflecting its boundaries not on the unity of a region, but on the circumstances of its birth. You can see this map of Revolutionary War independence shifting to the south after 1777, culminates in 1781 with the British defeat at Yorktown. This is a 1781 French engraving that shows the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and his army at Yorktown, which ended the War of Independence. You see in the picture the French fleet sitting just offshore, and this shows the newly independent United States occupying just a small part of the North American continent in 1783.